It's a winter night in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, just north of Philadelphia. Snow falls on a long, empty driveway lined with bare trees. At the end of that driveway sits a house, or what remains of one. 110 rooms, 70,000 square feet, a ballroom built for hundreds, a gallery once hung with Raphaels and Rembrandts, marble staircases, gold leaf, silk walls. It was called America's Versailles. It was designed to rival the palaces of European kings. And now it sits silent, windows boarded, ceilings collapsing, paint peeling from walls that once shimmered. The chandeliers are gone, the tapestries are gone, the paintings are gone, and the family who built it gone too. This is Lynnewood Hall, and you've probably never heard of it. You've heard of the Vanderbilts and their mansions. You've heard of the Astors, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers. But the Wideners? They were just as rich, just as powerful. And for a brief, brilliant moment at the turn of the 20th century, they were one of the most important families in America. They built this house to prove it. They filled it with art that would make a museum weep. They lived like European aristocrats, formal dinners, liveried servants, private rail cars, yachts. They were new money pretending to be old. And they were extraordinarily good at it. But something happened. Something that turned this palace into a tomb. It wasn't just time. It wasn't just taxes. It was tragedy. It was grief so total that it hollowed out the family from the inside. And it was the slow, grinding collapse of the world that made Lynnewood Hall possible in the first place. The Gilded Age was over. The fortunes were crumbling. The system that created them was eating itself. And Lynnewood Hall, with all its marble and gold, became a monument to something else. The impossibility of sustaining grandeur built on exploitation, speed, and luck. This is the story of how a meatpacking and streetcar tycoon built a palace to escape his working-class origins. How he lost his son and grandson on the Titanic. How his widow became a ghost in her own house. And how one of the grandest mansions in America turned into one of its most haunting ruins. But before we step inside, if you're the kind of person who loves deep investigations into power, wealth, and the stories behind the grandest buildings in history, if you want to understand not just what these places look like, but what they cost and who paid the price, then you're in the right place. Hit that like button, subscribe, drop a comment, and tell me, have you ever heard of the Wideners? Because this story deserves to be told. To understand Lynnewood Hall, you have to understand the man who built it. Peter A.B. Widener, born in 1834, the son of a Philadelphia brickmaker. Not wealthy, not connected, not special. Just another working-class kid in a city dominated by Quakers and old money merchants. Peter didn't go to college. He didn't inherit land or stock or titles. What he had was ambition. And he had timing. At 27, Peter opened a butcher shop. Then another. Then a chain. By the time the Civil War broke out, he had a contract to supply mutton to Union troops. Mutton. Not glamorous. Not noble. But profitable. War is always profitable for someone. And Peter Widener was smart enough to be that someone. After the war, he didn't go back to butchering. He went into streetcars. Philadelphia was growing fast. People needed to move. And Peter understood that whoever controlled the streetcars controlled the city. He partnered with a man named William Elkins, another self-made operator, another man who knew how to turn infrastructure into empire. Together, they built a streetcar monopoly in Philadelphia, then Pittsburgh, then Chicago, then New York. They didn't just run streetcars. They bought politicians, bribed city councils, crushed competitors, and turned public transit into private gold. By the 1890s, Peter Widener was worth over $50 million, close to $2 billion in today's money. He wasn't just rich. He was Gilded Age rich, Vanderbilt rich, Morgan rich. But here's the thing, no one treated him like it. Because he wasn't old money. He wasn't a Biddle or a Cadwallader or one of Philadelphia's mainline aristocrats who traced their families back to William Penn. He was the butcher's son, the streetcar schemer, the man who made his fortune in meat and bribes. And that stung. So Peter did what every nouveau riche tycoon does when society won't accept him. He built a palace so grand that no one could ignore him. He would force them to look. He would force them to bow. And that palace would be Lynnewood Hall. In 1897, Peter Widener bought 300 acres in Elkins Park, a suburb just north of Philadelphia. It was quiet. It was green. It was away from the noise and grime of the city he'd conquered. He hired Horace Trumbauer, one of the most fashionable architects of the era, a man who specialized in Beaux-Arts grandeur, in European revival styles that screamed wealth and taste. Trumbauer had designed mansions for other robber barons. He knew what men like Widener wanted. Not just a house, a statement. The design was French, neoclassical, inspired by Versailles, by the chateaux of the Loire Valley, by the aristocratic fantasy of pre-revolutionary France. Never mind that Peter Widener's grandfather probably couldn't read. Never mind that his fortune came from horse cars and meat contracts. This house would say, "I belong among kings." Construction took 3 years. The facade was Indiana limestone, white and gleaming. The entrance was flanked by columns and carved stone. Inside, 110 rooms, 3 floors, a grand hall with marble floors, and a double staircase curving upward like something out of an opera. A ballroom that could hold 300 people. A dining room with silk walls and hand-carved paneling. A library sheathed in mahogany. Bedrooms with private baths and dressing rooms. Luxury almost unheard of in 1900. Guest suites. Servants' quarters for 40 live-in staff. Kitchens, pantries, wine cellars, laundry rooms. An entire universe contained within 4 walls. And then there was the art. Peter Widener didn't just want a big house. He wanted culture. He wanted legitimacy. So he began buying paintings, sculptures, tapestries, furniture. He hired advisors, art dealers, experts, European agents, and he spent millions. Millions. Raphaels, Rembrandts, Van Dycks, Vermeers, Titians. Works that belonged in the Louvre or the Uffizi. And he hung them in his hallways. He put them above his fireplace. He filled his house with the kind of beauty that was supposed to prove he wasn't just rich, he was refined. But here's the question no one asked. Who paid for all this? Not in money, in labor, in lives, in the workers who laid every streetcar rail, in the meatpackers who worked in blood and stench, in the passengers who paid their nickels while Widener and his partners bribed city councils and monopolized routes, in the servants who scrubbed those marble floors and polished that silver and never, ever ate in the dining room. Lynnewood Hall was beautiful, but beauty is never free. By 1900, Lynnewood Hall was complete. And for the next decade, it was exactly what Peter Widener dreamed it would be, a stage, a theater of wealth, a place where new money could dress up as old power and play-act European aristocracy in the middle of Pennsylvania. Imagine stepping through those front doors in 1905. You're a guest, maybe a business associate of Peter's, maybe a society figure he's courting, maybe a politician he owns. The butler takes your coat. Your footsteps echo on marble. You look up and see the grand staircase sweeping upward, lit by a chandelier dripping with crystal. The walls are hung with paintings you've only seen in books. A Rembrandt self-portrait, a Raphael Madonna, a Van Dyck portrait of a Dutch noble. You're not in Philadelphia anymore. You're in a museum. You're in a palace. And that's the point. Dinner is announced. You're led into the dining room. The table seats 40. It's set with sterling silver, French porcelain, Irish linen. The walls glow with silk damask. Servants in livery stand against the walls, silent, waiting. Peter Widener sits at the head of the table. His wife, Hannah, at the other end. Their children, George, Joseph, Fitz, scattered among the guests. The conversation is controlled, polite, dull in the way that very rich people's conversations often are. No one mentions the streetcars. No one mentions the bribes. No one mentions the workers who built this place, or the fortunes extracted from nickels and dimes and city contracts. After dinner, you retire to the ballroom. A small orchestra plays. There's champagne. There's dancing. Outside, beyond the gates, Philadelphia sleeps. The workers who laid the rails, who drove the streetcars, who packed the meat, they're in row houses and tenements. They don't see this. They never will. This is Lynnewood Hall at its peak. And it's a lie. Not because the house isn't real. It is. Not because the art isn't beautiful. It is. But because the whole thing is built on a story that isn't true. The story that Peter Widener is a self-made man. That he earned this. That wealth like this comes from hard work and talent and vision. But here's what actually happened. Peter Widener made his fortune by monopolizing public infrastructure, something everyone needed, and extracting profit from it. He bribed politicians. He crushed competition. He paid workers as little as possible and charged riders as much as he could. He turned a public good into private wealth. And then he took that wealth and built a French palace in Pennsylvania and filled it with stolen European art. Stolen not by him, but by centuries of colonialism and war and aristocratic hoarding. And he called a taste. And people believed him. Or, at least, they pretended to. Because, in America, in 1900, if you were rich enough, you could buy anything. Even legitimacy. Let's talk about the servants. Because no one ever does. Lynnewood Hall required a staff of about 40 people to run. Butlers, footmen, maids, cooks, laundresses, gardeners, chauffeurs, stable hands. These weren't people Peter Widener knew. They weren't people he spoke to. They were invisible. They lived in the basement and the attic. They used the back staircases. They ate in the kitchen. They worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7. They were paid barely enough to survive. And they were expected to be grateful. Think about what it takes to maintain a house like Lynnewood Hall. The marble floors have to be scrubbed. The 110 rooms have to be dusted. The silver has to be polished. The fireplaces have to be cleaned. The linens have to be washed and pressed. The meals have to be cooked, breakfast, lunch, tea, dinner, sometimes multiple courses, sometimes for dozens of guests. The gardens have to be tended. The carriages, later, the cars, have to be maintained. The gates have to be opened and closed. The deliveries have to be received. And all of it has to be done perfectly, invisibly, without the family ever noticing the labor. Because that's the whole point of a house like this. It's not just about having space. It's about having so much space that you never have to see the people who make it possible. It's about living in a world where your needs are met before you even know you have them. Where your comfort is so total that you forget it's being created by someone else. And it wasn't just the servants. It was everyone who made Peter Widener's fortune possible. The streetcar drivers who worked 12-hour shifts for pennies. The meatpackers who stood in blood and filth. The riders who had no choice but to pay whatever fare Widener set because he destroyed every competitor. The politicians who took his money and looked the other way. The system that allowed one man to turn public infrastructure into private empire. Lynnewood Hall didn't just cost millions of dollars. It cost thousands of lives, not in the sense that people died building it, but in the sense that their labor, their health, their time, their dignity were extracted and converted into marble and gold and Raphaels. And no one in that dining room, sipping champagne under a chandelier, ever talked about it. By 1912, Peter Widener was 78 years old. He'd built an empire. He'd built a palace. He'd forced Philadelphia society to accept him, or at least acknowledge him. And now it was time to pass it on. His eldest son, George Dunton Widener, was 50. George had been groomed for this his entire life. Educated. Married well, his wife, Eleanor, came from a respected Philadelphia family. They had 3 children. Harry, Eleanor, and George Jr. George ran the family businesses alongside his father. He collected art. He lived in his own mansion on the Lynnewood estate, smaller than his father's, but still grand. He was everything Peter had wanted him to be, a second-generation tycoon, refining the rough edges, turning new money into something that looked like old. And then there was Harry, George's eldest son, Peter's grandson, 27 years old in 1912, Harvard educated, book collector, bibliophile, quiet, scholarly, Not a businessman like his father and grandfather. Not ruthless. Not hungry. But smart. Thoughtful. The kind of young man who spent his money on rare books instead of racehorses. The kind of young man who seemed like he might take the Widener fortune and do something different with it. Something softer. Something almost respectable. In April 1912, George, Eleanor, and Harry were in Europe. It was a buying trip. Art for George. Books for Harry. Eleanor went for the society, the shopping, the glamour of London and Paris. They'd spent weeks there. They'd bought paintings. Harry had found a rare 1598 edition of Francis Bacon's essays. He was thrilled. They were ready to come home. They booked passage on the newest, largest, most luxurious ship in the world. The one everyone was talking about. The one that was supposed to be unsinkable. The RMS Titanic. You know this story. Everyone knows this story. The Titanic left Southampton on April 10th, 1912. It was going to New York. It was supposed to be a triumph. The maiden voyage of the greatest ship ever built. 2,200 people on board. First class was filled with millionaires. John Jacob Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidore and Ida Strauss, and the Wideners. On the night of April 14th, George and Eleanor Widener hosted a dinner party in the ship's a la carte restaurant. It was their way of thanking the captain, Edward Smith, for his hospitality. The meal was extravagant: oysters, filet mignon, foie gras, champagne. The kind of dinner you'd have at Lynnewood Hall, transplanted onto a floating palace in the middle of the Atlantic. Harry was there. So were other first-class passengers. They ate. They drank. They laughed. Outside, the ocean was dark and calm. The ship cut through the water at 22 knots. Everything was perfect. And then, at 11:40 p.m., the Titanic hit an iceberg. You've seen the movies. You've read the accounts. You know what happened next. Confusion. Denial. Panic. Lifeboats launched half empty because no one believed the ship could actually sink. Women and children first. Men standing on deck, smoking cigars, waiting to see what would happen. And then slowly, the realization, this ship is going down. Eleanor Widener was put into a lifeboat. She survived. George stayed on deck. So did Harry. They helped women and children into boats. They stayed calm. They did what men of their class were expected to do. Faced death with dignity, with restraint, with the same performative stoicism that had built Lynnewood Hall in the first place. At 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, 1912, the Titanic sank. George Dunton Widener drowned. Harry Widener drowned. 1,500 people died. And Eleanor Widener, sitting in a lifeboat in the freezing Atlantic, watched the ship disappear beneath the waves. Watched the lights go out. Watched her husband and her son die. She was rescued by the Carpathia. She sailed into New York a week later. And when she arrived, she had to tell Peter Widener, her father-in-law, the man who'd built an empire, the man who'd built Lynnewood Hall to prove that he could have anything, that his son and grandson were gone, that the succession he'd planned was destroyed, that everything he'd built was, in one night, made meaningless. Peter Widener never recovered. How could he? He was 78. He'd spent his entire life building. And now the people he'd built it for were dead. George was gone. Harry was gone. The future was gone. He lived for 3 more years. But they weren't really years. They were a slow, gray fade. He stopped collecting art. He stopped entertaining. Lynnewood Hall, which had been a stage, a theater, became a mausoleum. The rooms were still there. The paintings were still there. But the life was gone. Peter walked those marble halls like a ghost. He sat in that library, surrounded by books his grandson would never read. He ate dinners in that dining room at a table that felt emptier every night. He died in 1915. He was buried in the family plot at Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia. And when he died, the question became, what happens to Lynnewood Hall now? When Peter Widener died, Lynnewood Hall passed to Eleanor Widener, not to Joseph, Peter's younger son, not to any of the other surviving family. To Eleanor, the widow of George, the mother of Harry, The woman who'd survived the Titanic and lost everything in one night. And here's the thing, Eleanor didn't want it. She had her own mansion in Philadelphia, a beautiful Gilded Age townhouse on Broad Street. She had her own life, her own routines, her own grief. Lynnewood Hall was Peter's dream. It was George's inheritance. It was never hers. And now it was a monument to loss. Every room reminded her of what she'd had and what was gone. The dining room where George used to sit. The library where Harry used to read. The ballroom where they'd hosted parties that felt, in retrospect, like a cruel joke. All that beauty, all that grandeur. And for what? But she kept it. Because that's what you did. You didn't abandon a palace. You didn't walk away from a Widener legacy, even if it was killing you. So Eleanor lived there. Sort of. She stayed in a small suite of rooms on the second floor. She closed off most of the house. She kept a skeleton staff, maybe a dozen people instead of 40. She rarely entertained. She rarely left her rooms. She became, in a very real sense, a prisoner of the house her father-in-law had built. And the costs kept coming. Because that's the thing about a house like Lynnewood Hall. It doesn't stop needing money just because you stop using it. The roof still needs repairs. The heating system still needs to run. The grounds still need to be maintained. The staff still needs to be paid. And all of that costs a fortune. Peter Widener had left Eleanor wealthy. She inherited millions. But even millions don't last forever when you're trying to maintain a 110-room palace that was designed for a different world. A world where labor was cheap and taxes were low and fortunes felt infinite. That world was dying, and Lynnewood Hall was dying with it. Let's talk about why Lynnewood Hall and houses like it became unsustainable. Because it wasn't just about Eleanor's grief. It wasn't just about bad luck. It was about a fundamental shift in American economics and culture. The Gilded Age, roughly 1870 to 1910, was a time of extreme wealth concentration. Robber barons built monopolies. They paid almost no taxes. The federal income tax didn't exist until 1913, and even then it was tiny, just 1% on incomes over $3,000, and a maximum of 7% on the very richest. Labor was cheap. Regulation was minimal. If you were a tycoon, you could extract wealth on a scale that's almost unimaginable today, and you could keep nearly all of it. But after World War I, things started to change. The income tax went up by 1918. The top rate was 77%. The political climate shifted. Progressives pushed for labor rights, antitrust enforcement, and wealth redistribution. The public turned against the robber barons. The fortunes started to fracture, and the massive estates, the Gilded Age palaces, became liabilities. Because here's what it cost to run Lynnewood Hall in the 1920s. You needed staff, at least a dozen people, probably more. Let's say $50,000 a year in wages, adjusted for inflation. That's close to $800,000 today. You needed heating. The house had a massive coal furnace, and heating 70,000 square feet through a Pennsylvania winter was obscenely expensive. You needed maintenance, roofs, plumbing, electrical, masonry, painting. Easily another $50,000 a year, probably more. You needed groundskeeping. 300 acres don't maintain themselves. You needed insurance. You needed security. You needed property taxes, which, after new tax laws in the 1920s, started to climb. Add it all up, and you're looking at $200,000 to $300,000 a year just to keep the house standing. That's $4 million to $5 million in today's money, every year. And that's if nothing goes wrong. If the roof doesn't leak. If the furnace doesn't break. If you don't have to repair the marble or replace the plumbing or fix the ballroom ceiling. And what were you getting for that money? A house you couldn't fill. A staff you barely needed. A ballroom you never used. A monument to a world that no longer existed. Eleanor could afford it for a while, but just barely. And every year it got harder. The money bled out. The house stayed empty. And the question became not if Lynnewood Hall would be abandoned, but when. In 1942, Eleanor Widener died. She'd lived at Lynnewood Hall for 27 years, 27 years of grief and ghosts and silence. When she died, The house passed to her surviving children, Eleanor Jr. and George Jr., and they made the decision that Eleanor Sr. could never bring herself to make. They sold the art, not all at once, not in a dramatic auction that would make headlines, but quietly, piece by piece, painting by painting. A Rembrandt here, a Raphael there, a Van Dyck, a Vermeer. Some went to private collectors. Some went to museums. Ironically, many ended up at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., which Peter Widener's collection had helped establish in the first place. His will had bequeathed much of his art to the nation, but Eleanor had kept some of the most valuable pieces at Lynnewood. Now those were leaving too. And with the art gone, something fundamental changed. Lynnewood Hall had been a museum, a gallery, a place where beauty justified the excess. Now it was just a big, empty house. The paintings had been the excuse, the story you could tell yourself. Yes, it's excessive, but look at that Raphael. Look at that Rembrandt. This isn't just wealth, it's culture. But culture can be moved. Beauty can be sold. And when it was, what was left? Just rooms, just marble, just gold leaf on a ceiling no one looked at anymore. The house was becoming what it had always been underneath, a monument to ego and extraction, stripped of its disguise. By the late 1940s, the remaining Widener heirs had moved on. They didn't live at Lynnewood Hall. They didn't want to. George Jr. had his own life. Eleanor Jr. had hers. The house was too big, too expensive, too haunted by grief and memory. It represented a world they didn't belong to anymore. A world of butlers and balls and European pretension that felt increasingly absurd in post-World War II America. So they did what made sense. They tried to sell it. But who wants to buy a 110-room mansion in 1948? Who has the money to maintain it? Who has the staff to run it? America's super-rich were building different kinds of houses now, sleeker, more modern, in California and Florida and Sun Valley. The Gilded Age palace was out of fashion. It was a relic, a white elephant, a symbol of an era people wanted to forget. The house sat on the market for years. The price dropped, and dropped again, and still no one bought it. Because what do you do with a place like Lynnewood Hall? You can't turn it into apartments. It's not zoned for that, and the layout doesn't work. You can't run it as a hotel. It's too far from anything, and the cost would be insane. You can't make it a museum. Who's going to visit? You can't tear it down. That would cost a fortune too. And besides, some part of you knows that destroying it would be a kind of sacrilege. So it just sits, empty, waiting, decaying. Finally, in 1952, someone made an offer. An organization called the First Pennsylvania Corporation for Boys, a now-defunct charity that ran a religious-based school for troubled youth. They bought Lynnewood Hall for a fraction of its original value. Accounts vary, but it was somewhere in the range of $100,000 to $200,000, a price that wouldn't have covered a single year of Peter Widener's art purchases. And so Lynnewood Hall, the American Versailles, became a boys' school. Imagine that. Imagine the grand ballroom filled with bunk beds. Imagine the dining room where Peter Widener hosted champagne dinners, now serving institutional meals to teenagers. Imagine the marble staircases echoing with the footsteps of boys who had no idea what this place had been. Imagine the library, the room where Harry Widener once kept his rare books, turned into a classroom or storage room. The school stripped parts of the house to make it functional. They removed some of the ornate fixtures. They covered the silk walls with paint. They installed industrial lighting and cheap furniture. They cut the estate down from 300 acres to about 30. They sold off the rest of the land for suburban development, tract houses, shopping centers, the kind of middle-class sprawl that would have horrified Peter Widener. The school ran for about 20 years. By all accounts, it wasn't a particularly successful operation. Funding was always tight. Enrollment fluctuated. And the house itself was a nightmare to maintain. Heating it, repairing it, keeping 110 rooms from falling apart when you don't have a tycoon's fortune to back you up. It was impossible. The house was too big, too expensive, too grand for its new, humble purpose. In the early 1970s, the school closed, and Lynnewood Hall was abandoned again. What happens to a palace when no one takes care of it? What happens when the roof starts to leak and no one fixes it? When the windows break and no one replaces them? When the copper pipes are worth more as scrap than as plumbing? It rots. For the next 3 decades, Lynnewood Hall sat empty. Vandals broke in. Thieves stripped the copper, the brass, the anything worth selling. Graffiti appeared on the walls, tags and slogans and crude drawings covering the silk and plaster that had once glowed under chandeliers. The roof leaked. Water poured into the upper floors. Ceilings collapsed. Plaster crumbled. Wood rotted. Mold spread. Animals moved in, raccoons, rats, birds. The grand staircase, once polished marble, was covered in debris and filth. The ballroom, where 300 guests once danced, became a cavern of peeling paint and broken glass. The dining room was gutted. The library was stripped. The bedrooms were shells. The servants' quarters, already Spartan, were unrecognizable. The grounds became overgrown. The gardens died. The gates rusted. The driveway cracked. And through it all, the house stood. Because that's what these places do. They don't die quickly. They die slowly, room by room, year by year, in a long, humiliating decline that mirrors the fortunes that built them. By the 1990s, Lynnewood Hall was considered one of the most endangered historic houses in America. Preservationists sounded alarms. Architects documented the decay. Local news stations ran stories. There were hand-wringing op-eds about American heritage and the tragedy of letting a national treasure crumble. But no one wanted to pay to save it, because saving Lynnewood Hall would cost millions, tens of millions, maybe 100 million, if you wanted to restore it to anything close to its original condition. And for what? To turn it into a museum that no one would visit? To make it an event venue in a market that didn't need another one? To let some billionaire buy it as a vanity project? The economics didn't work. The purpose didn't exist. And so the house kept rotting. Over the last 30 years, Lynnewood Hall has changed hands multiple times. Each new owner arrives with a plan, a vision, a dream of restoring it to glory. And each one eventually confronts the same brutal reality. This house is a black hole for money. In 1996, a man named Richard Yoon bought the property. He was a reverend, a leader in the Korean American community in Philadelphia. He said he wanted to turn Lynnewood Hall into a community center, a place of worship, a cultural space. It was a noble idea, but noble ideas don't fix roofs. Yoon held the property for years, but restoration never really began. The house continued to decay. Local preservationists grew frustrated. There were legal battles over permits, over zoning, over what could and couldn't be done with the property. Yoon eventually tried to sell. In 2016, Lynnewood Hall sold again, this time to a local developer who said he wanted to preserve it. Rumors swirled about what might happen. Maybe luxury condos, maybe a private club, maybe a restoration with a boutique hotel. The price was reported as $16 million, a number that sounds big until you realize it would cost 5 or 6 times that just to restore the house to a livable state, let alone its original grandeur. As of the early 2020s, the house is still privately owned. It's still closed to the public. It's still decaying. The current owner has reportedly done some work, stabilizing parts of the structure, securing the property against further vandalism. But full restoration? That's not happening. Maybe it never will. Because the fundamental problem hasn't changed. Lynnewood Hall is too big, too expensive, too impractical. It was built for a world that no longer exists, a world where a single family could command the labor of 40 servants, where heating and maintaining 110 rooms was just a line item in a tycoon's budget, where excess was celebrated instead of condemned. In 2025, that world is gone, and Lynnewood Hall is a fossil from it. Let's be clear about what's saving. Lynnewood Hall would actually require, because this isn't just about slapping on some paint and fixing a few windows. This is a house that has been neglected for decades. The damage is catastrophic. First, you'd need to stabilize the structure. That means fixing the roof, all of it, replacing rotted beams, rebuilding collapsed ceilings, repairing the masonry where water has eroded the limestone, addressing the mold and water damage throughout the upper floors. Cost: $10 million to $20 million minimum. Then you'd need to restore the mechanical systems. The plumbing is gutted. The electrical is ancient and dangerous. The heating system, if it even exists anymore, would need to be completely replaced with something modern that can actually heat 70,000 square feet without bankrupting you. Cost: another $10 million to $15 million. Then there's the interior. You'd need to restore the plasterwork, the wood paneling, the marble floors, the silk walls, if you could even source materials like that anymore. You'd need to recreate the chandeliers, the fixtures, the details that were stolen or destroyed. You'd need craftspeople, artisans who know how to do Beaux-Arts restoration, and there aren't many of those left. Cost: $30 million to $50 million, possibly more. And then even if you did all that, even if you spent $75 million or $100 million and restored Lynnewood Hall to perfect condition, you'd still have the same problem. What do you do with it? You can't live in it. Not really. Not unless you're a billionaire who wants to cosplay as a Gilded Age robber baron and can afford a full-time staff and annual operating costs in the millions. You could turn it into a museum, but that requires an endowment to cover operating costs, and it requires enough visitors to justify the investment. Lynnewood Hall is in Elkins Park, a suburb of Philadelphia, not a major tourist destination. It's not the Breakers in Newport. It's not Hearst Castle. It doesn't have the name recognition or the location to draw crowds. You could turn it into an events venue, weddings, corporate retreats, galas. But that market is saturated, and retrofitting a historic mansion for modern events, ADA compliance, parking, kitchens, bathrooms, is expensive and often compromises the historic fabric of the building. You could sell it to a private buyer. But who? And for what? The super rich today don't want Gilded Age mansions. They want modern, efficient, private compounds with smart home technology and sustainable design. They want Malibu or Aspen or the Hamptons, not a crumbling palace in suburban Philadelphia. So you're left with a paradox. Lynnewood Hall is too important to tear down, too beautiful, too historic, too symbolic. But it's also too expensive to save and too impractical to use. It exists in a kind of limbo, neither fully alive nor fully dead. And maybe that's fitting, because Lynnewood Hall was always a symbol. When Peter Widener built it, it symbolized his arrival, his triumph, his ability to force the world to see him as something more than a butcher's son. But now it symbolizes something else. It symbolizes the unsustainability of extreme wealth, the fragility of fortunes built on monopoly and extraction, the impossibility of maintaining grandeur that depends on exploitation, the inevitability of decay. It symbolizes what happens when you build a monument to yourself and forget that monuments need people to care for them, that beauty requires labor, that grandeur requires cost, and that when the labor stops and the money runs out and the people who cared are dead, what you're left with is just a building, just stone and wood and plaster. And those things rot. Lynnewood Hall is a warning, a cautionary tale. It says, this is what happens when you build a palace on a foundation of streetcar monopolies and meatpacking profits and bribes. It lasts for a generation, maybe two, and then it crumbles. Because the system that made it possible crumbles. Because the world changes. Because people get tired of bowing to robber barons. Because fortunes fracture. Because grief and taxes and time and entropy eat everything, no matter how much gold leaf you put on the ceiling. And yet, there's something beautiful about it. Not in a triumphant way, in a melancholy way, in the way that ruins are always beautiful, because they remind us that nothing lasts, that even the most powerful men die, that even the grandest houses fall, that history is not a straight line of progress, but a cycle of rise and fall, building and decay, glory and ruin. Lynnewood Hall is not a museum. It's not a monument. It's a ghost story, and maybe that's all it was ever meant to be. Let's go back to the people who made Lynnewood Hall possible. The ones we didn't talk about at dinner. The ones who didn't dance in the ballroom. The servants. We don't know their names. Most of them, anyway, because servants don't leave records. They don't write memoirs. They don't appear in newspaper society pages. They're mentioned in passing, a staff of 40, and that's it. They're invisible, by design, but they were real people. They had lives, families, dreams, and they spent years of those lives scrubbing Peter Widener's floors, cooking his meals, washing his linens, tending his gardens. They lived in the basement and attic of Lynnewood Hall. They worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7. They were paid maybe $20 or $30 a month. Barely enough to survive, let alone save. They had no labor protections, no benefits, no real recourse if they were mistreated. If they complained, they were fired. If they were injured, they were replaced. And when Lynnewood Hall closed, when the family left and the house was sold and the staff was dismissed, what happened to them? We don't know, because no one cared enough to write it down. They scattered. They found other positions, maybe. They went back to the working-class neighborhoods they'd come from, Irish immigrants in Kensington, black workers in South Philadelphia, European immigrants in the Northern Liberties. They took jobs in factories, in other houses, in shops. They disappeared back into the anonymity they'd always occupied. And that's the part of the Lynnewood Hall story that almost never gets told. When we talk about Gilded Age mansions, we talk about architecture and art and tycoons and scandals. We talk about the Titanic and Raphaels and champagne dinners. But we don't talk about the women who washed the champagne glasses, the men who hauled the coal that heated the house, the cooks who stood over hot stoves for 12 hours a day, the gardeners who worked in the Pennsylvania summer heat to keep the grounds looking perfect. We don't talk about them because the house was designed to make them disappear. The back staircases, the servants' quarters tucked away in the basement, the strict rules, don't speak to the family unless spoken to, don't be seen unless necessary, don't exist. And it worked. They vanished. From history, from memory, from the story. But they were the foundation of Lynnewood Hall. Literally. Without them, the house doesn't function. Without them, there's no dinner, no ballroom, no polished marble, no perfect lawns. The whole fantasy collapses. And that's what makes Lynnewood Hall's decay so fitting. The house that erased its workers is now being erased itself. The marble is crumbling. The gold leaf is peeling. The grandeur is rotting. And maybe that's justice. Not revenge. Just entropy. The house returning to the earth it was pulled from. The labor dissolving back into anonymity. The lie of permanence. Revealed. And then there's the family. Because they suffered too. Not in the same way. Not in a way that erases the exploitation that built their fortune. But suffering nonetheless. Think about Eleanor Widener. She lost her husband and her son in one night. She survived the Titanic, was pulled from the freezing Atlantic, and then had to live with that for the rest of her life. She had to go back to Lynnewood Hall, the house her husband and son would never see again, and live there for 27 years. Can you imagine that? Walking through those halls every day, seeing the rooms they'd lived in, the chairs they'd sat in, the paintings they'd looked at, having dinner in a dining room where George's chair sat empty, sleeping in a house that echoed with absence. Lynnewood Hall became her prison. She could have left. She had the money, the freedom, but she stayed because grief is a prison too, because she felt she owed it to them, because the house was all she had left of the life they'd built together. And what about Peter Widener? He built Lynnewood Hall to prove he belonged, to show the world that a butcher's son could live like a king. And it worked. For a while. But what did it cost him? He spent his last years in that house, surrounded by beauty and silence, knowing that the son he'd groomed to inherit it was dead, knowing that his grandson, the sweet, scholarly boy who loved books, was dead, knowing that everything he'd built was, in the end, just stone and gold, beautiful, useless, hollow. There's a kind of Greek tragedy to it. Peter Widener wanted immortality. He wanted his name to echo through history. And he got it, just not the way he imagined. His name is remembered, but not for his business genius, not for his art collection, for his loss, for the Titanic, for the mansion that became a ruin. That's the psychological cost of a house like Lynnewood Hall. It's not just the money. It's the weight, the expectation, the pressure, the feeling that you have to live up to the grandeur, that you have to be as big and perfect and untouchable as the house itself. And when you fail, when tragedy strikes, when the money runs out, when the world changes, the house doesn't comfort you. It judges you. It stands there, 110 rooms of marble and gold, and it says, you weren't enough. You couldn't keep this going. You failed. And maybe that's the cruelest part of Lynnewood Hall. It wasn't built for living. It was built for display, for performance. And when the performance ended, the house had nothing left to offer. Ask someone today, anyone who's even vaguely heard of Lynnewood Hall, and chances are they'll mention the Titanic. The house itself might be a footnote. The Widener fortune might be a mystery. But the Titanic? Everyone knows the Titanic. That's because the sinking of the Titanic is one of the most famous disasters in history. It's been mythologized, dramatized, analyzed, and retold for over a century. It's a story about hubris, about class, about the unsinkable ship that sank. And the Wideners are part of that story. George and Harry Widener died on the Titanic. That's the headline. That's the hook. And because of that, Lynnewood Hall gets pulled into the Titanic's orbit. It becomes the house haunted by the Titanic tragedy. It becomes the place where Eleanor Widener returned after surviving the disaster. It becomes, in the cultural imagination, not a monument to Gilded Age excess, but a monument to grief. And that reshapes how we think about the house. It makes it sympathetic, tragic, human. It's easier to feel sorry for a widow who lost her husband and son than it is to feel sorry for a robber baron who bribed city councils. It's easier to focus on the Titanic than on the streetcar monopoly. And so that's what we do. But here's the thing. The Titanic connection, while real and devastating, is also a distraction. It's a way of making Lynnewood Hall's story palatable. It lets us feel emotions, sadness, pity, awe, without confronting the harder questions. Like, where did the money come from? Who paid for it? What system made this house possible? And why do we, even now, romanticize these places? The Titanic gives us a tragedy we can understand. A clear villain, the iceberg, the hubris, the insufficient lifeboats. A clear victim, the 1,500 people who died. A clear moral, don't build unsinkable ships, don't ignore warnings, don't let rich people monopolize the lifeboats. But Lynnewood Hall's real story is more complicated. Because the tragedy isn't just that George and Harry died. It's that the house was built on thousands of small tragedies. Workers injured on streetcar lines. Families priced out of their own cities. Servants who spent their lives in invisibility. And those tragedies don't have a clear beginning or end. They don't have a single dramatic moment. They're just the grinding, systemic extraction of wealth from labor. And that's harder to turn into a story. So we focus on the Titanic, and Lynnewood Hall becomes a ghost story instead of a cautionary tale. But Eleanor Widener did do something lasting, something that, in a strange way, redeemed part of the family story. In 1915, 2 years after the Titanic sank, Eleanor donated $3.5 million to Harvard University to build a library in memory of her son, Harry. The Widener Library. It's one of the largest university libraries in the world. It holds over 3 million volumes. And it's built around Harry's personal collection, the rare books he'd spent his short life collecting, including that 1598 Bacon edition he'd bought in London and carried with him onto the Titanic. The library is beautiful, classical, grand but not gaudy. It's a place of learning, of scholarship, of quiet contemplation. It's everything Lynnewood Hall wasn't. Where Lynnewood Hall was about display, the Widener Library is about preservation. Where Lynnewood Hall was about wealth, the Widener Library is about knowledge. Where Lynnewood Hall was private, closed, exclusive, the Widener Library is open, public, democratic in its way. And that's Eleanor's real legacy. Not the mansion she lived in like a ghost. Not the fortune she inherited and watched bleed away. But the library. The place where Harry's love of books became something useful, something that outlasted the fortune. something that served people, students, scholars, researchers, for over a century. It's a small redemption. It doesn't erase the streetcar monopolies or the meatpacking profits or the servants who were paid pennies. But it's something, a gesture toward using wealth for something other than spectacle. A recognition that maybe the best way to be remembered isn't with a palace, but with a place where people can learn. And it raises a question. What if Peter Widener had built the Widener Library instead of Lynnewood Hall? What if he'd taken that fortune and put it into universities, hospitals, public works, things that might have actually improved people's lives, instead of just proving how rich he was? What if the Gilded Age tycoons had built libraries and schools instead of ballrooms and yachts? We'll never know, because they didn't. They built palaces, and now those palaces are rotting. Lynnewood Hall is, in the end, a story about America, about the myths we tell ourselves, about the costs of those myths, and about what happens when the myths collapse. Peter Widener's story is the American dream, right? Poor kid, works hard, makes his fortune, builds a palace, dies rich. That's the story we love. That's the story we tell ourselves over and over in books and movies and political speeches. Anyone can make it. All you need is ambition and grit and vision. But Peter Widener didn't make his fortune through hard work alone. He made it through monopoly, through political corruption, through extracting wealth from public infrastructure that everyone needed and no one else could provide. He made it by paying workers as little as possible and charging riders as much as he could. He made it by operating in a system that was designed to concentrate wealth, not distribute it. And Lynnewood Hall is the physical manifestation of that system. Every marble column was paid for by streetcar fares. Every chandelier was bought with money that should have gone to better wages, better working conditions, better public transit. Every painting was extracted from a monopoly that strangled the city. That's not the self-made man. That's the self-serving man. And the difference matters. Because when we romanticize Gilded Age fortunes, when we tour these mansions and marvel at the chandeliers and sigh over the tragedy of their decay, we're ignoring the reality of how they were built. We're letting ourselves be dazzled by the beauty and forgetting the blood. And that forgetting is dangerous, because it allows us to believe that wealth like this is earned, that the system is fair, that if you just work hard enough, you too can build a Lynnewood Hall. But you can't. Not anymore. And maybe you never could, because fortunes like Peter Widener's weren't built on merit. They were built on monopoly, corruption, and a tax system that barely touched the super-rich. They were built in a specific moment in American history, a moment when labor was cheap, regulation was weak, and wealth could be accumulated on a scale that's almost unimaginable today. That moment is gone, and Lynnewood Hall is its corpse. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The system that created Lynnewood Hall isn't entirely gone. It's evolved. It's changed shape. But the core dynamics, the concentration of wealth, the exploitation of labor, the use of political power to entrench economic advantage, those are still here. We don't have streetcar monopolies anymore. We have tech monopolies. We don't have meatpacking barons. We have private equity and hedge funds. We don't have Gilded Age mansions. We have mega yachts and private islands and sprawling compounds in Jackson Hole and Atherton. The aesthetics have changed. The mechanisms have changed. But the underlying logic is the same. Extract wealth from labor and infrastructure. Use political power to protect that wealth, and then spend it on displays of grandeur that signal your dominance. And just like in Peter Widener's time, the costs are hidden. We don't see the Amazon warehouse workers. We don't see the gig economy drivers. We don't see the outsourced labor in developing countries. They're invisible, just like the servants at Lynnewood Hall were invisible. And that invisibility is the point. Because if we saw them, if we really understood the human cost of the fortunes being built today, we might ask harder questions. Questions like, why do we allow this? Why do we celebrate billionaires? Why do we treat extreme wealth as an achievement instead of a failure of policy? Why do we let public goods be privatized and turned into profit engines? Why do we accept that some people can have $100 billion while others can't afford health care or housing or food. Lynnewood Hall doesn't answer those questions, but it makes them unavoidable. Because when you look at that crumbling mansion, you see the end point. You see what happens when fortunes built on extraction run out of things to extract. When the workers push back. When the tax system tightens. When the political winds shift. When the money bleeds away and the palace becomes a ruin. And you realize this is what always happens. Fortunes rise. Fortunes fall. Palaces are built. Palaces crumble. And the people who paid for them, the workers, the servants, the exploited, they're forgotten until someone bothers to remember. So should we save Lynnewood Hall? That's the question preservationists and historians and architecture buffs have been arguing about for decades. And it's not an easy question. On one hand, Lynnewood Hall is a masterpiece of Beaux-Arts architecture. It's historically significant. It's beautiful even in ruin. It represents a specific moment in American history, a moment we need to remember, even if it's uncomfortable. Letting it crumble feels like letting history disappear, like erasing evidence of what we were, for better or worse. On the other hand, saving Lynnewood Hall would cost tens of millions of dollars. Money that could be spent on housing, healthcare, education, infrastructure. Things that actually improve people's lives. And what would we be saving it for? To turn it into a museum that glorifies a robber baron? To let some billionaire buy it as a vanity project? To preserve a monument to exploitation so that people can tour it and Instagram the marble staircase? There's something obscene about spending $100 million to restore a rich man's palace while people are homeless, while schools are underfunded, while infrastructure is crumbling. It feels like repeating the same mistake Peter Widener made, prioritizing grandeur over people. And yet, there's value in preserving difficult history, in keeping places that make us uncomfortable. Because Lynnewood Hall isn't just a beautiful mansion. It's a document. It's evidence. It tells a story about wealth and power and exploitation that needs to be told. And if we let it disappear, if we let it crumble and get bulldozed and turned into a parking lot, we lose that story. We lose the physical reminder of what Gilded Age fortunes actually look like. And it becomes easier to romanticize them, to forget the cost. So maybe the answer is, preserve it, but tell the whole story. Don't restore it to perfect condition. Don't turn it into a glamorous venue. Leave the decay visible. Leave the cracks and the water stains and the peeling paint. And tell the truth about Peter Widener, about the streetcar monopoly, about the servants, about the Titanic, about the rise and fall, about what this house was built on and what it became. Make Lynnewood Hall a ruin we can learn from, not a palace we admire. So here we are, 2025, over a century since Peter Widener built his American Versailles. Over 80 years since Eleanor Widener died and the art started leaving. Over 50 years since the house was abandoned. And Lynnewood Hall still stands. Barely. The roof leaks. The windows are broken. The ceilings have collapsed in places. The grand staircase is covered in debris. The ballroom is a shell. The silk walls are gone. The chandeliers are gone. The paintings are gone. The family is gone. But the house remains. A ghost, a monument, a warning. It stands there in Elkins Park, behind rusted gates, hidden by overgrown trees, slowly being reclaimed by nature and entropy. And it asks a question that we, as a society, still haven't answered. What is all this wealth for? Peter Widener built Lynnewood Hall to prove he mattered, to force society to see him, to create something that would outlast him. And, in a sense, he succeeded. The house is still here. People still talk about it. His name is still remembered. But what's the legacy? A ruin, a cautionary tale, a symbol of excess and hubris, and the inevitable decay of fortunes built on exploitation. That's what outlasted him. Not glory, not respect, just a crumbling mansion that no one wants and no one can afford to save. And maybe that's the point. Maybe Lynnewood Hall's decay is the most honest thing about it, because it reveals the truth that the marble and gold were designed to hide. Nothing lasts. Not fortunes, not dynasties, not palaces. Everything built by human hands eventually falls. And the grander the building, the harder the fall. But before we leave Lynnewood Hall behind, we need to remember the people who made it possible. Not Peter Widener, not the architects or the art dealers, the workers, the servants, the invisible labor that kept the fantasy alive. We need to remember the streetcar drivers who worked 12-hour shifts so Peter Widener could buy Rembrandts, the meatpackers who stood in blood and cold so he could host champagne dinners, the maids who scrubbed the marble floors, the cooks who prepared the meals, the gardeners who tended the grounds, the footmen who opened the doors, the laundresses who washed the linens. We don't know their names. We'll never know their names. But they were real. They had lives. They had families. They had dreams that were deferred or destroyed so that Peter Widener could have his palace. And when we talk about Lynnewood Hall, when we marvel at its grandeur or mourn its decay, we have a responsibility to remember them, to tell their story, even if it's incomplete, to acknowledge that every inch of that house was built on their labor, that the beauty came at a cost, and that the cost was paid by people who never got to enjoy what they built. That's the real tragedy of Lynnewood Hall. Not the Titanic, not the financial collapse, but the erasure, the forgetting, the way that 40 servants can spend years of their lives keeping a palace running and then disappear from history without a trace. We can't bring them back. We can't undo the exploitation, but we can remember, and we can refuse to let their erasure continue. And finally, Lynnewood Hall is a mirror. It reflects back to us our own values, our own contradictions, our own hypocrisies. When we romanticize Gilded Age mansions, we reveal our fascination with wealth and power. When we tour them and Instagram them and sigh over the chandeliers, we participate in the same fantasy that Peter Widener was selling. That extreme wealth is beautiful, desirable, admirable. But when we see them crumble, when we see Lynnewood Hall with its collapsed ceilings and broken windows, we're forced to confront the reality. This is where extreme wealth leads. Not to permanence, not to legacy, to decay, to ruin, to emptiness. And maybe that's the lesson Lynnewood Hall has to teach us, that the pursuit of grandeur for its own sake is hollow, that building monuments to yourself is a waste, that wealth without purpose, without compassion, without awareness of its cost, is just greed dressed up in marble and gold. Peter Widener wanted to be remembered. He wanted his name to echo through history. He wanted to build something that would last forever. And he failed. Because Lynnewood Hall isn't a triumph. It's a tragedy. It's a symbol of a system that concentrates wealth in the hands of a few and leaves everyone else to pay the price. It's a reminder that fortunes built on exploitation eventually collapse. It's proof that you can't buy immortality, no matter how many Rembrandts you hang on your walls. But here's the strange thing. In failing, Peter Widener accidentally created something more valuable than he intended. He created a lesson, a warning, a monument not to his success, but to the unsustainability of the world he lived in. Lynnewood Hall stands today barely, precariously, as a testament to the fact that palaces fall, that fortunes crumble, that the Gilded Age is over and good riddance. And if we're smart, if we're paying attention, we'll look at Lynnewood Hall and ask ourselves, are we building our own version of this? Are we creating our own palaces that will rot? Are we concentrating wealth and power in ways that future generations will look back on with horror and confusion? Because the system that created Lynnewood Hall isn't entirely gone. It's evolved. And if we're not careful, we'll end up with our own ruins, our own monuments to excess and exploitation, our own crumbling palaces that no one wants and no one can save. Lynnewood Hall is a ghost story, but it's not over, because the ghosts are still here. The inequality, the exploitation, the myth of the self-made man, the worship of wealth, the erasure of labor, those ghosts haunt us still. And until we face them, until we confront the systems that create palaces and leave everyone else in the cold, Lynnewood Hall will remain exactly what it is, a warning we refuse to heed. It's a winter night in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania. Snow falls on the long, empty driveway. At the end of that driveway sits Lynnewood Hall. 110 rooms, 70,000 square feet, a palace built to rival Versailles, a monument to a tycoon's ambition, a tomb for a family's grief, a ruin that refuses to die. The windows are dark. The gates are locked. The house is silent. But if you stand there long enough, if you let yourself feel the weight of the place, you can almost hear them. The echoes, the footsteps of servants on the back stairs, the clink of champagne glasses in the ballroom, the laughter of George and Harry Widener before the Titanic, the quiet weeping of Eleanor, alone in her rooms, the ghost of Peter Widener, walking through halls he built to prove he was someone, realizing too late that no one cares. Lynnewood Hall is dying. Maybe it's already dead, but its story isn't. Because as long as we keep building palaces, as long as we keep worshiping wealth, as long as we keep ignoring the costs and forgetting the people who pay them, Lynnewood Hall will matter. It will stand there crumbling in the snow, asking the same question it's been asking for 100 years. What is all this wealth for? And until we have a better answer than to prove I matter, the house will keep rotting, the fortunes will keep collapsing, and the cycle will continue. Lynnewood Hall is a warning. Are we listening?